All right. Hey guys. Thanks for having me tonight. I'm happy to be here. A little bit about myself. My name is Dave Goldman. I have been working at Microsoft for just about 20 years now, all in the Exchange messaging product. Um, I just got a recent title change. Used to be called the Premier Field Engineer for anybody that's called in and worked with Premier. We've been renamed to Customer Engineers now. For anybody that has done any offline address book work, that was me. I wrote the support stance for that and published OAB Integ. Anyone that's used or had offline address book from 5.5 to 2013 is probably familiar with that. One of the current modules that I'm working on now is PS Service Principal, which is allowing onboarding for EXO v2 PowerShell certificate-based authentication and MFA. So that'll help with basic auth deprecation if anybody's doing that. I'm one of the contributors to the PS framework. And the PS framework, I've written the Azure Analytics logger as well as the SQL logger for that. And anybody that is interested, I have some of my stuff up on GitHub. My Twitter handle is here, and my LinkedIn page, and is my work experience if anybody's interested in that. And I like to keep an open meeting when I'm talking. So I've got 4 monitors here, so I have everything spaced out. If anybody has any questions, feel free to use the Teams little hand icon or just paste something in the chat. I definitely don't mind if there's something that you have a question or that you want to go over. And tonight, what we're going to talk about is some of the topics here. So with object formatting, there's a little bit that goes into it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover just the basics of PowerShell objects, the PowerShell pipeline. This talk on pipeline may not be what you're expecting, but it goes a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of what happens under the covers with PowerShell. I'll go into the formatting selection process on how we build and generate those views. I'm going to show some demos on extending and formatting the objects and how you can do this interactively with a live PowerShell session on the fly. And then for those of you that actually use modules or create your own modules, how you can make this happen. And then I have some fun stuff in there for those that are interested. If you debug PowerShell or if you're interested to see how the stuff works under the covers, I have some breakpoints and stuff. And that'll be pretty cool. So what I'm going to do is going to talk a little bit about PowerShell objects. Okay, so traditionally in PowerShell, everything happens in the context of an object, and these objects are what wrap and hold the data that we use. So if I pull up my window here, I'm just going to kick off my lab for you guys. All right, and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So for example, if I do a get process, and I'm going to do a get process, select one, you'll notice that this object comes back as some kind of display. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this to a variable, and I'm going to send this to get member. And what you'll notice, what PowerShell has done, if I can get this to scroll up, it has created an object for us with a type name system diagnostics process. And you'll notice that this object has some metadata with it. So we have some alias properties. We have events that can be used if we want to trigger off of a particular action methods or functions that we can call, and then all of the properties that are associated with this particular object that we're doing here. Every object that you create is going to be of a base type. So what I'll do is I'm going to show you, let me see. Oh, Sujin wants to know where we get the URLs. You can definitely take notes, and There, I have the URLs. I'll post those at the end so you can download the project that has these, and then that way you can play around with those. And by all means, if anybody has any questions about this stuff, you can get me on Twitter. You can send me an email, and we can cover that. All right, so I'm gonna run get process here. And this is the same thing. I just saved it out. So we see that we have a process, and we have a couple little things here. So we have a view, and we have some information. Now, with respect to the objects, I just wanted to point out three simple things. So if you run get member is going to show you all of the items that are associated with that. By default, for a system.diagnostic process, there's 92 metadata elements. A lot of people are not really familiar with using force or static, but if you use the force, especially if you're in Star Wars, you'll notice that we get 167 items back. And then if you're using the static ones, you get 10. And now I'll show you what these are. So if I run get process, this just dumps out all of the data that we can use. If you dump it out with the force, what'll happen is you'll see a lot more data come back. So as you scroll up on that object, you'll start to see set methods. You'll start to see the get methods of how we're actually populating that data. Each one of these has a different type associated with it. And the statics, these are ones that are inherited from .NET object by default. So every object that gets created has an equals. And for this, if I dump it out, and I'll show you, there's some hidden properties on here. We have something called PS type names. The PS type names on an object shows you the inheritance tree for a particular object. So this started as a .NET object, it was marshaled, and it gets converted to a component, and then by PowerShell, we convert this into a system.diagnostic process. So we're just extending the types by adding extra data of whatever we want. So that's just kind of give you the gist of using objects, because you need to know what data you're actually going to want to format, and that's going to be the data that's going to be contained in that object. So let me just move this out of the way. So now that we have objects out of the way, we'll talk a little bit about pipelining and formatting. So in a traditional PowerShell window, as you saw, I ran get process. With the PowerShell pipeline, I'm going to pipe in a bunch of commands, and here you'll see I have several pipes. So I'm going to do get process. I'm going to pipe this to where object, where I'm instructing it to get all the handles that are greater than 50. I'm asking PowerShell to sort the object by name and handles, and then format this table. So what's going to happen here is, as I'm typing this information in, the PowerShell parser is calculating these tokens, making sure that my code is correct, and then it will start to execute. We'll call get process. That will go and create that object, get the data that we need, pass it down to the next pipe. In this particular section where we're doing the where object, we're going to start to filter that object down, because we only want to have objects in here that are going to contain 50 handles or greater. We'll get that data, we'll pass that along to the next pipe, which will get sorted by name and handles. And now there's some interesting stuff, and this is where the magic happens. So when we get to the end of the pipeline, and this is something that you don't typically see, by default, we'll add out default, and out default does a couple things. The first thing it does is it's responsible for calling into the PowerShell formatting engine. The engine is where we do the lookups to see if there's any views associated with that particular object. In this case, we have a process, and I'll end up showing you that in a little bit. Once we have formatted whatever data we're going to send out to the console, Oops, let me go back. That data will be given to out host, and that'll go to the console, and that'll be the display that you will see. Now, I'm going to focus in a little bit on the out default right before you get to see the display. The formatter has a selection process that it goes through. And the first thing that it needs to do is to see if there's actually a pre-defined view in PowerShell that's associated with that object. This is a system process, so there is a defined view. These views get created at runtime when you start that PowerShell session, and they get stored in a table cache. If there's been no predefined view for this object or whatever object you're working on, the second thing we do is we actually check to see if there's a user defined one. This is the one that we're going to key on tonight, and we're going to create our own. Those user views are defined by two particular files, which I'll go through. That's a types file and a format file. They both have an extension of a PS1 XML. If there is no predefined or user view, the formatter then will check for something called the default display property set. And if that is there, then PowerShell will go and display it. And then ultimately, if that's not there, then PowerShell is going to say, hey, I'm going to just do my best whatever I can. Let me format this, whether it's going to be in a table or in a list. In this case here, we've asked for a table. So that's what we get displayed on this output. And I'm going to switch back over here. So I'm going to get process. And you'll notice here I'm using force parameter, where object, and I'm dumping out PS with the wildcard. And you'll notice that there's some PS properties on an object that you don't typically see. They're hidden. You have to use force to actually see those. The first one I showed you was the PS type name. That is the one that's going to show the type of the object. That gets mapped back to the caching table. And then the PS standard members. And this is the default display property set. Basically what this is if I go to a process and I dump it out, you'll notice here for this default display, we're going to show ID, handles, CPU, and so forth. If I actually dump out that object, you'll notice that this is in a table format and these map over here. Name is an alias for process name, but you can kind of see that this would be the default that would get displayed when you do a get process. Now in the system, there's two files. There's two types of files, and the files that actually generate these are the types PS1 XML. These allow you to extend your object. So when you talk about a PowerShell object, it's just can be anything that you want it to be. You can add to it, you can remove to it, you can add those properties, methods, whatever you want that object to do. And then there's the format PS1 XML. The format is going to allow you to change the view to whatever you want. So you can create a custom table, you can create a custom list, you could make it wide, or it can even be custom. These are XML files, pretty easy to change. Now, one thing I do want to make a big mention on this, actually two things. Number one, the type PS1 and the format PS1, these files are signed. You never want to alter those by default. They will wreak havoc on your PowerShell environment and you'll have all sorts of issues. So just don't do it. You always can make a copy of them, which I'll show you how to do, and then you could work off of those and you can use them real time in your PowerShell session, or you can add them to your modules, and I'll show you how to do that. And tonight I'm working in PowerShell 5.1. You will notice that if you're starting at PowerShell 6 or 7 or whatever RC that you're using, is that the type files are no longer part of the added. They've been actually compiled into PowerShell. So they're already part of the system. You'll just have the format files, and all of them are stored in PS Home, which is a variable that is gonna point to your Windows PowerShell directory. So if I do PS Home, and if you guys have your machines with you, you can do this. I'm not going super fast. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to dump these out. And this is the first one. So these are all of the format files that are introduced with PowerShell. You'll notice that there's a format, and earlier we were working on a diagnostic object. So you'll notice that there's one there predefined. And these are the types. And we have one that's just a generic .NET. We have one for types and get event. And so these are the files that get loaded into the PowerShell session that have those views there. So if you get session, get job, get process, you make a CIM or WMI call, there's going to be some type of formatting for those there. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up two. And all I did for this is I just called Notepad on that PS Home, and I just opened up just the .NET and the types. And by the way, guys, let me know, is the screen okay for you guys, or is it too small?
It looks good on my end, but I won't speak for everybody.
All right. If anybody has any issues seeing it, just let me know. So in the type file, I'm going to do a search for process, and this is going to take me down to here. And all I did was just do a search for win process. And here's the process. So now for a system.diagnostic process, if I go back to PowerShell, I'll show you how this all clicks together. Here's my process, and you can see that I have handles, non-page memory, and so forth. If I go back to the respective files, here's the types file that's going to extend it. You can see here we have some members, right? We have some alias properties for process name, handles, VM, which is being referenced by virtual size, working set for WS, and then you can actually see down here for this type of system.diagnostic process, you can start to see the reference property type. So we have the ID, handles, and that's what you saw when we actually dumped it out. How we format that is in the respective format ps1.xml, and you'll notice that we have the name. First we have the view, then we have it's called a process, and here's the type name. So when we're formatting that object, PowerShell needs to have a particular type to key off of. And you'll notice that on that PS type names, you see system.diagnostic process. And so here's the view for system diagnostic process. You can see that we are generating a table control, and we're actually indicating what we want to have this set to. And so for handles, we're saying we want the width to be 7, set it to right, NPM, and we kind of go down here, and this is how we generate it. You'll notice for some of the table entries, we have some code in here. Later on, I'll show you how to add those in and what they do, but when we particularly call these, we'll execute a script block, and this is kind of how we're calculating those properties that you see get displayed in PowerShell. So these are the two respective files that work with each other. Now, procedurally, there's a couple of different ways when you create an object. So by default, anything created by PowerShell is going to have a type associated with it. What will happen is when you start to work with your own objects and you're creating custom objects, they're not going to have a PS type name by default. And that's something that we're going to want to add. And this can be done by doing add member. And then we have two functions. These functions are used in your PowerShell session. One of them, the first one is update type data. This is where we can update the type and then we can update our format data. And what I'll do is I'll go back to PowerShell. All right, and so here, I'm just going to clear the screen. And I'm going to create a custom object, PS custom object. And if I dump out this, you'll notice that this started as a .NET system object and it became a PS custom object. That's what we created, but there's no type associated with it. So this is the very basic building block of being able to generate these views. If I do a get member, we'll see that I have all of the note properties that I have added on here, and then we have some defaults. Again, if I use the force, I'll notice that I start getting all of the PowerShell ones that I need to. These are the ones that are critical for me to operate on this object. And I've already dumped out the type name, so I don't need to do it again. So there's three ways to do this. The first way is you can create your own custom object. And what you'll want to do is you'll want to add a PS type name. So if you notice up here in my custom object, I didn't do it by default. So if I go and create a new object and I dump out the type name, you'll notice that in the type table, I have custom object 1. Now this object is ready to be tied to a format. That's the first way to do it. If you already created it, maybe you're in a situation here where you're working with another team, they've created their PowerShell code, they don't have any types, and they're like, hey, Dave, we need you to format this. So I'm not going to create a new object to do that. What I could do is I could add a member. So if I add that member and now I dump out my custom object, I can see my custom object, which is up here. Now it has a type name, and I just called it my custom object. You can call this whatever you want to call it. And the third way that you can do this is off of the PS type name, there's going to be some methods. So if I dump this out, and what I'm doing is I'm actually dumping the custom object. Let me take it back a step. So I'm going to dump this out. You notice that there's a PS type names. I'm going to go back here, and we're going to dump that. All right, there we go. Now, on the PS type name, we also have some methods. The one that we're interested in here is the insert. And this is where I can call this method. And if I dump this back out, you'll notice that I have inserted that at position 0 or element 0 in that collection. So now this custom object 3 has a type name. Subsequently, if you made a mistake or you did something else, like let's say you typed 2 3s. And if you were just curious on how to do that, what you can do is you can go and call the remove method. Whoops. It's got to be by type. Oh. And if I go and dump this back out, you'll notice that that's gone. And so you want to be careful when you're creating custom objects, because if you add two and you have it one name, but you have it referenced differently in the format file, it won't work. And then you'll try to dump out your information and you'll say, why is this not working? So does anybody have any questions up to this point? No? Okay. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to show you how to do this on the fly in PowerShell session. So the update type data has a couple parameters here. The first one is going to be the type name. This is going to be what is referenced in the type name for your object. And in this case, we used my custom object right here where we added it. We are going to use the default property set. This is going to be the first name and company. That's what I chose. You can choose whatever else you want. We're going to have a default display property, in this case, first name. And then we're going to have the key property set for custom properties. And what we're going to do is, if I dump this out first, just to give you an idea of what it looks like, we're just getting a list. So PowerShell didn't know what to do with it. There was no format. It said, hey, just going to render this in a list. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this command, and you'll notice that I'm using the force here for this update. And now if I go back to my custom object, you'll notice that I have on the fly now updated the type cache, and I'm only stating print first name and company. Now, the cool thing about this is, opposed to using a select object, when you run select object in your pipeline, what you're asking PowerShell to do is to create a new PS custom object for you with the data that was associated with that selection. Here, what we did is we just changed the view. If I look at the custom object here, and I look at the force to dump everything, I can still see that all of my data exists on this object. Now, if I wanted to, and I said, oh, I made a mistake, let me go and add some more stuff. I want to change the default, and I want to add last name. And so now I'm starting to customize on the fly what I want this data to look like, because I may have another team or coworker that wants me to hand this off to them, and they don't want all of that data. They maybe just need a couple things. I'm not throwing away any data. I'm retaining the object. I'm only changing what I want to be displayed. Another way to do that, just to show you that here, is I'm just using some really nasty, disgusting formatting, which is real easy to do if you're new and starting out. I've done it using the formatter, but you can then go ahead and pass in your variables, and that's a lot. This is probably not the best way to go ahead and display something, so you can do it this way. Now that we have generated that view, let's go and take a quick look at this, and we're going to dig down into this object really quick. So I'm going to run get member with force. We're going to grab the standard members, and you'll notice that we have the default display property. You'll notice that this is first name, matches first name, the default display property set. So you can kind of start to see how this ties in. So now when I go to send this down the pipeline, I ask PowerShell to display my custom object. What this will do is it gets to out default, as I explained before. We don't have a predefined view through PowerShell, but we have a user-defined view. And that's the user-defined view that I had set up here. And so now PowerShell can say, great, I know what the default is, I know what the set's going to be, let me print this out. Now, mind you, that is for I did this for a table. If I go and I generate a format list, you'll notice we still get just those three. And so this allows you to massage and manipulate the data any way that you want to do this. Now you can also generate these views based, you can make them on a list, you can make them custom, you can make them wide. The custom ones pretty much have code in them. Those are just not the vanilla generic ones that you have there. And let me go to the next one here. So let me go back real quick. All right, so you may be wondering how do we actually get access to these files? So what I've already done this, but I'm going to open it up in Notepad just to show you. This is the one that I'm using for my custom object. And I already have it here, but I'm going to just slide it over so you can read it in the window. Be a little bit easier. And so you'll notice that I have my view, the name, the type name matches my object. And for here, this is my table control. I just pick the default values, but I want everything in the center. And then for my rows, here's my first name, last name, and this is everything that you're going to want to put there. Now, I will make one suggestion. By default, the table headers are not needed. You can just have the table row entries. If you've seen some stuff on the internet, you've seen both. If you're going to use custom code, so for example, I want to display first name, this will display first name. If I wanted to do some massaging of this, which I'll show when we work on the module, and I want the names to be changed if they're over, say, a certain amount of characters, you would have to take first name and move it up to the column as a label. And then here's where you'd put your script block so you can do your code. And I'll show you an active one of those in a little bit. Then what you're going to do is you're going to update it. So say you're working on an object, you have your custom object, and you want to update this on the fly. You go and you have a copy of this. Once you have this, save it. You can change the custom, the type name to whatever you want, and then you can modify these fields as you see fit and use that as a generic template, so you don't have to always input it, create it. That's what I do. And then what you would do is once it's created, you would do your update. And now you'll notice that on the fly, I updated my format. So now I get my entire object based on my format in a table. And you notice here, first name, last name, date, time, first name, last name, date, time. And so now I have constructed a user defined view for my custom object. And I can still go back, and if I do my format list, we didn't have anything defined for a list. So what PowerShell went to do is it said, hey, there's a default display property set. This is what we're going to use. If that data wasn't there, then PowerShell would have just spit out everything else in a list. And then you would have a bunch of stuff there. So that kind of shows you how you can have two different views going at the same time. And they've totally been updated on the fly. Now, for how we want to create one of these, if we run get type data, you can pass in any type name that you want, which is valid in PowerShell. For me, I did this off of a job, and you'll notice that the type names return several entries. So we have a Win32 scheduled job, we have an automation job, state info, and these kind of go down. what you want to do to create one is you're going to run the get format data. Okay, this is going to give you the formatted view for this, and then you can export that out to the file. You'll actually want to run this in, whoops, run this in one command. And then here I have a format command that'll pull in that XML. And what I'll do is I'll run this. It'll open up Notepad and I'll paste it in. And what I have done now is I have pulled the generic job format. Now this gives me a clean slate with the information off of a job, because in my presentation here, I have some custom jobs and I have some custom sessions. That's what I use from when I'm troubleshooting at work. And so you notice I have taken this and now I can massage this, save it, and do what else, whatever else I want to do with it. And that's how you create them. So it's just very simple. It's just the get type data and the format data. Now, if you're going to create your own custom object, you don't need to take the type, you just need the format. And then all you have to do is just create that XML and update it on the fly. The type data is if you want to do anything without having to do the view, you can do both, because PowerShell will look for those. Now, there is one thing that I did want to show you with regards to dynamic list expansion. If I do, let me see. All right, you'll notice here for the data that was returned, I did a get address list and I actually did a get mailbox and pull back users. You'll notice that I'm only by default displaying 4, right? And I should have shown this before, but I'll pull it up now. There's a hidden variable called format enumeration list. By default on mine, it's set to 4. If I run my job, this one's not going to run. Looks like the PowerShell gods have gotten me. All right, you have to bear with me for a second. PowerShell's not wanting to play nice.
It happens. Don't worry.
This is the frustrating thing about Visual Studio Code. Unfortunately, anyone that uses it, I'm sure, experiences this on a daily basis. All right. All right, so this should have finished. Man, PowerShell's being rough tonight with me. I'll have to do this. There you go. I'll just do it manually if it doesn't want to do it. All right, here we go. So What's important to remember about PowerShell is that if it's going to do default formatting for you, you may see something like this. So in this case, I pulled back to address list memberships, and you'll notice by default, we only have 4 objects that are being displayed. And so a lot of times you have to go through a great deal of frustration and configuration, and you have to go in there and, dump out the actual object, do a format table, auto size wide. Well, what's cool about the format enumeration list is you can change that. And then if I go back to dump out my objects, you'll notice that I don't have to do all that horky stuff with format table, auto size, wide. I can split out and show as many variables or items in a collection that I want. So by default, it's set to a small limit. So that way you don't have to take up a lot of real estate. So a lot of people don't know about that. And so I just wanted to throw that one out there for you. So if you are doing custom objects and you are pulling back a collection of items, that's important to know. Specifically if you're working with jobs. That's important because you'll pull them back and then you'll lose some of your information there. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you now what I've done is I've shown you how to do this interactively in a PowerShell session. Now for those that use modules or create modules, I'm going to show you how to do it in here, and there's a little bit more to it. So I'm going to clear the screen, and what I'm going to show you this will be in the files that you could download from GitHub. These 2 particular, get job type and get sessions. By default, this is what get job displays. So it just gives you the ID, name, the job type, has more data, location, and command. Now, you totally could go and dump out the job type like we did before and modify that if you wanted to. If you wanted to change some of this, and then what you'd have to do is you would have to run the get format data, and then you can have this, display what you want it to display. What I've done is I've created a function behind mine, and you'll notice that there's some inherent differences here. So the first thing working with jobs that I find personally to be a pain in the neck is that you always have to go get the job type, and then you have to go find out if it's a child job, and then you have to go hunting and pecking for the data. I want the data to be right here. So in this particular example, you'll notice the data field. It's only returning 4. In this case, it was 4. I have changed the custom formatting to add the ... if the names are over a certain amount of characters. So keep that in mind if you're doing custom script blocks, that your format enumeration may look a little bit different. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear the host, and then I'm going to do a get PSS session. And you're going to see that this, just this generic get session. For me, that's quite boring. So what I want to do is I want to get some good wholesomeness there. And for me, because I'm in the exchange world, I have to do a lot of troubleshooting, which typically revolves around what ports we're connecting to, if we're using MFA, what supported versions we're using. So I changed the format to be for me. So in this case, I can see the formatted supported versions that would be on the PowerShell virtual directory. So if I wanted to match up, in this case, my PowerShell is not connecting, I can look at the endpoints and see what's going on, and I can also see what port we're connecting to. As before, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign my first session. I like to do stuff, you can do it off ID. I particularly like to add an index because the index is easier for me to work off of. And you'll notice that I have the format list. Now, this is the format list for a generic session. I don't know about you, but going through idle timeouts, I really don't like spending a lot of time on MSD and having to dig around and figure out what those are in milliseconds and seconds and converting them. So what I do a little bit different, and this is where the power of this comes in, is I could format my own. And you'll notice that my output looks a lot different. And I selected what I want to be there. So I want the name, if it's open, the supported sessions, the versions that are supported. By default, you don't see those over here. You have to dig around in some of the other areas for that. So you have to get into the configuration information to start digging for those. I want them to be right there. I care about, hey, what's the proxy authentication, what port we're connecting on, and I actually want something in user friendly format. Hey, my cancel timeout is 1 hour. You know, this is my idle timeout's 15 minutes. Have no idea what this is. So how does that work in a module? And there's a couple things you need. The first thing is when you get to your PSD1 file, your descriptor file, if you scroll down, there's going to be a field here. It's the formats to process. And this is where you have your generic format file. So if I go to my XML directory and I look at my formats, you can put multiple ones in here. So earlier I told you I would show you some of the script blocks, so I'll show you here what I did on mine. I have a name, it's the module and for jobs, and I have my table columns. You'll notice for name, earlier I didn't have a label, but I had made a mention to it. Here I added a label, and if you notice, as I come down to my table rows, I put a specific comment that this is a script block for the name. And so when PowerShell goes through and the formatting engine says, oh, hey, there's a script block associated with this, before you print name, what I want you to do is execute the script block. And so what I did is I just gave this as a variable underscore. Is weird, but I was just testing some stuff out and wanted to see if that worked, and it did. So here I'm pulling the name value. If the length is greater than 15, I want to just trim it and then just add 3 dots to it. Otherwise, if it's short like EXO, just print it out. And that's kind of like what you see here. If I scroll up, you can start to see, like, this stuff happening. And then I have my regular fields, and then I did the same thing down here for the command and data. And the data specifically, because when you're returning data on a job, you have to run receive job. And then if you don't keep it, you've lost the data that you're already working on. So I make sure that I pull it back, and I want it to be readable. That's the first part, right? So you have your PSD1, which will go to your format file. I highly suggest that you just use the default, and then you can just add them in here, separated by a space and just a comment. It's really going from view to view, and you can have as many as you want in there. The second portion you saw earlier when we were in an interactive PowerShell session, what I've done is I've created a function, right, called getJobType. And this is an advanced function. I've given it an alias of GJT for getJobType. And you'll notice in here, I've created a custom object, just like I did before. And I've given it that PS type name. And this is, I used the module name job. So if I go back to my format, you'll notice that that has to line up. A lot of times, you can fat finger something, cut and paste will kill everybody. I have done it a million times where I'll cut and paste it, and it's off by 1 character, and it's not going to work. And you're going to go crazy going, why is this not printing? So you want to make sure that your type name and the name match your PS type name. That is what PowerShell is keying off of. Okay, and then you'll notice I just created my object and I just pulled out what I want to display. For me, in the data field, in a regular job, it just tells you, hey, we have more data. Well, where is it? Right? I know the command that I ran, but then I got to go do a receive job. I got to go find the ID, and I got to go do all of this stuff, where I can just run get job type, and I have my stuff here. And like I said before, I like to work off of indexes, so it's easier for me when I'm doing stuff. And I can just dump that out. I've kept my data, because if you notice what I've done on the job itself, when this runs, I keep it. So I have it in my display, but I can also have it when I go back. A lot of people forget that, and then they've lost the data if they didn't save it to a variable. And then I've tailored this. So here's my default view. And then when I go to format in a list, this will look a little bit different. I've also changed this as well. So I have my index, and you'll see all of these fields here. You'll see them here. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is that if you're going to do custom fields, you're going to want to make sure the names match for best practices. So for example, job warning, if I go to my XML file and I go down to job, where's my job? My job, here's my index, job ID. Okay, now let me show you this. You'll notice you'll notice something here. I wanted to make sure that I pointed this out too. In my job, I have a ton more variables than what I do in the format file. The format file, when you run get jobs, you don't want this thing running off the screen, especially if you don't have a lot of real estate. So I've only added a couple properties, and it ends at data. However, if you add more, when you go and you do that format list, that is where you're going to get the rest of your data. And you're just going to want to make sure that those match. You'll see here job warning, job error. You didn't see those before. So I'm using a combination of the table and the list, so that way I can pick and choose if I need to, or I can actually dig down into the object itself if I wanted to pull something out right off of that object. Same thing what I did with my sessions. If I go down here, you'll notice for the session, here's the get session type. And so you'll notice, again, ID, name, there's only just a couple. Right? And you can use spaces if you want. From there, if you go to session, one thing that you want to keep in mind is if you're going to use spaces, you definitely want to put it in quotes. I find that the single quote works better. You don't have to worry about string expansion or anything like that. And here I've done a little bit of work, but what I do is I get my PS session. If it looks like Exchange Online, I just rename it, and then I go and I dig in. So as I was mentioning before, off the session object, you have that hidden PS, the PS objects. Here I get the base. I go for the application private data, and I look to see if it has a supported version, and it does. And I save those, and then I start to construct my custom object, and then I can do calculations or whatever I want to do, so I can have my data in a user friendly readout, which this makes more sense especially if I had to cut and paste this and send this to a customer or another colleague or someone and say, hey, here's what the customer's timeout values are set to. Maybe you find something that's just crazy. Saves you a boatload of time of having to do conversions and all of that kind of crazy stuff. And so that is pretty much the gist of it. Actually, right now at 10:30, so it's ended right at 1 hour, which is great to leave time for questions and doing this if you guys want to do this on the fly. And actually, Matt, let me leave this up here so people can get a copy of this too. For those of you guys that are interested at a level 3 to 400, what you can do if you go to PowerShell and GitHub, you can fork and clone the PowerShell code, and these are the breakpoints and in the particular files if you want to actually debug this. So what you would do is you would go and create your own view, your own custom view, your own custom object. You don't have to do it in a module. You can just do it in an interactive session with update type data and update format data like I did, and then set these breakpoints, and you could walk through that code and you can actually see the flow of how this works, where we call out default, we look for the view, we construct it, we see which one is there, if there's any properties. If you guys want to do that, that's pretty cool. So I'll leave that there so you can get a screenshot.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. That's useful.
Yeah, I found I spend most of my time in a debugger, so for me, I want to know how it works. And this is really cool. Now, it will take you a little bit to get going, but these are all of the breakpoints and lines where I have, found it. And the easy one is to do the default display property set. If you search for that guy and set a couple of breakpoints on him, you'll always hit it.
Cool. I do see one question in chat from William Lee.
Yeah, let me switch over here real quick. Are there any memory concerns with keep? No. So yes and no. For what I do, there's not, because I'm working on mailbox objects. My customer that I work with has roughly 400,000 objects, and we've run several jobs, and I have not run into any issues. Now, with that being said, that's going to depend on the resources that you have on your system. If you're pulling back SQL queries or something from a database that has gigs and gigs of data and you're keeping it, yeah, then you probably could run into an issue. But for me, that's I have it working for myself. That is going to be completely dependent on use case. That may be something that you just want to get, serialize it, write it to disk, and then delete that job. William, does that make sense? Cool. Anytime. Yeah, that's just something you're gonna have to play with that and just test that out and see how that works for you. And you guys can come off of mute too, man. I'd love to chat with you guys if you don't want to type.
Jeff, it should be posted within the next few days, just whenever I have time to sit down and download it and upload it to YouTube. You shouldn't be muted by default. You should have the ability to unmute.
Justin's using the Teams in the browser, so maybe having
Oh,
some issues
gotcha.
there with the
Makes
chat.
sense. Yeah.
I see Edgar and Jeff are also typing there. Justin, we're gonna have to get you moved over to Edge. Yeah, Edgar, thank you. If you guys have any questions whatsoever, and for anybody that had started late coming in, what I'll do is I'll put my info back up here on the screen again. And here's my Twitter handle. Feel free to reach out to me, send me a message. I love chatting about this stuff. So if you have a particular use case or you have some questions, Justin's asking, what use cases do you see other people tend to use this for? I see this a lot at work. So I've seen use cases where people are doing database queries. The admins are pulling back service queries, and there's other groups that only need a little bit of the information. What they do, if they have constructed the views, and somebody will go to a web portal and they are able to display those properties there. Um, that's it's a little bit easier there when you're displaying just what you need and not having to actually do a query and then sort and then cut down stuff, so you're saving on data transmission. I see a lot of people use this for customers. They'll send them a big log. They'll say, hey, we're troubleshooting this issue. It's a connectivity issue. Send it. They have this view constructed to just show a couple little things, like my example with Exchange. I want to see supported versions. I want to see the negotiation protocol. I want to see what port. I don't care about anything else because I want to see what's happening with the connection. The other data is there if I need it, and I haven't gotten rid of it. And a lot of people will use select object, and then they've thrown the data away. Then you got to go and requery again. Is there a way to provide color formatting based? So not within PowerShell, at least with native PowerShell. There is. I haven't found a way to do it in the table, but I have found a way to do it another way, and I'll show you guys this. So I use PS Framework, and PS Framework, for those that haven't used it, it was generated by a coworker, and it is an awesome tool. And in there, you can write different messages and stuff like that. So if I had my particular object here and I wanted to display it, like say for example, let me see. Oh, I restarted my session. Let me go back here real quick. So I have my custom object, and if I had any particular code, it wouldn't be particularly in the table, but what I could do is I could grab something from there, and I can say like name, and then I could do, and this is all going to be totally dependent on what somebody wants to do. Now, for the formatting in the table, no, but if you want to get kind of crazy and do this a different way. Oops. Yeah. What did I forget? Yeah. Green. That should work. Let me test. Let me do this a different way. Okay, so that's working. So what you could do is you can use PS read line. You can change it that way, or you could use PS framework, which will allow you to do HTML color coding, and you can kind of construct your views that way, but not with native just a format table. But definitely, if you wanted to format your own list, you could definitely you can do. Now, one thing that I haven't tested this out. You could possibly do it with HTML formatting if you wanted to display it that way as the end result. I'll test that out. I've done it for other things, but I haven't done it with the formatting for this. Justin, does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Oh, and I know why that didn't work. Oh, it's the value. Okay. So, yeah. Any other questions? All right, man. I think that's it.
All right, I'll go ahead and stop the recording.